take this man to be your husband, in sickness and in health, so help you God.
The folks of Blackwood County thought they were punishing Gabriel Cross when they forced him to marry Oakhaven's disgraced 32-year-old spinster at gunpoint. They expected a tragedy. Instead, they handed the quietest woman in town the keys to the mountain and unleashed a reckoning that still haunts the valley today. In the spring of 1882, the town of Oakhaven, Colorado, was a place built on timber, silver dust, and suffocating hypocrisy. At the bottom of the social barrel was Abigail Stanton. At 32, Abigail was universally dismissed as Oakhaven's resident old maid. A childhood bout with polio had left her with a faint limp, but it was her sharp, unyielding intellect that truly scared off suitors in a territory that valued obedience over brains. She lived as an unpaid servant in the home of her older brother, Ryan Stanton, mending clothes, scrubbing floors, and enduring the daily, quiet humiliations of a woman deemed past her prime and entirely useless. Above them all, both geographically and socially, was Gabriel Cross. Gabriel was a ghost made of muscle, scars, and wolf fur coats. A former Union sharpshooter who had seen too much blood at Antietam, he had retreated to the jagged peaks of Bitterroot Ridge a decade prior. He came down to Oakhaven only twice a year to trade pelts for coffee, gunpowder, and salt. He spoke to no one, his dark, heavy-browed gaze enough to part a crowd on the boardwalk. The town whispered that he was half wild, a savage who would sooner skin a man than shake his hand. The inciting incident of Oakhaven's greatest nightmare began with a stray calf and a late April whiteout. Ryan, unwilling to risk his own skin, had sent Abigail out to the tree line to retrieve a wandering heifer just as the sky turned a bruised, violent purple. The temperature plummeted 40 degrees in an hour. By the time the snow blinded her, Abigail was miles from the homestead, her skirts frozen solid, her lungs burning with ice. She collapsed near a cluster of blue spruce, resigning herself to the long dark. That was where Gabriel found her. He had been tracking an elk when he stumbled upon the frozen lump of calico in the snow. Without a word, he hoisted her over his massive shoulder, abandoned his hunt, and trekked 3 miles up a near vertical incline to his cabin. For 3 days and 3 nights, the blizzard raged. Inside the one-room cabin, Gabriel worked tirelessly to save her limbs from frostbite, boiling snow for tea and wrapping her in thick bear hides. They barely spoke. He offered no improper advances. He treated her with the careful, detached reverence one might give a wounded hawk. In the quiet glow of the hearth, Abigail realized the monster of Bitterroot Ridge was simply a man who preferred the honest brutality of nature to the polite cruelty of society. On the 4th day, the storm broke, and Gabriel brought her down the mountain. They rode into Oakhaven on his massive draft horse, expecting relief. Instead, they rode into an ambush. A crowd had gathered in front of the livery, whipped into a moral frenzy by Mayor Josiah Higgins and Reverend Thomas Reed. Oakhaven was not acting out of concern for Abigail's virtue. They were acting out of greed. For 2 years, Mayor Higgins and his silent partners at the Pacific Railway had been trying to seize Bitterroot Ridge to lay a lucrative timber train spur. Gabriel had aggressively repelled every surveyor sent up the mountain. Now, Higgins saw his golden opportunity. 3 nights, unchaperoned, with a savage. Reverend Reed thundered as Gabriel helped Abigail down from the horse. "This woman is ruined, compromised beyond salvation." Ryan Stanton pushed his way to the front, face flushed with feigned outrage. "You've soiled my sister Cross. You've brought shame on my house." Gabriel stood in front of Abigail, his hand resting casually near the grip of his Colt revolver. "I saved her life," he rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "She slept by the fire. I slept by the door. That don't matter to the eyes of God or the law," Mayor Higgins barked, signaling the town's corrupt deputy, Elias Cobb. 4 men leveled shotguns at Gabriel's chest. "You've got 2 choices, mountain man. You swing from the hanging tree for defiling a white woman, or you do the Christian thing. You marry her right here, right now, and take her off Ryan's hands." Abigail stared in horror. She understood the play immediately. If Gabriel was hanged, the town could seize the ridge. If Gabriel married her, he would be tied to the town legally. They believed that once Abigail was his wife, Ryan could easily manipulate or bully his meek, spinster sister into coercing Gabriel to sell, or, more likely, they would arrange for Gabriel to have a fatal hunting accident, leaving the easily intimidated old maid as the sole inheritor of the mountain. Gabriel looked at the shotguns, then looked back at Abigail. He saw the way she trembled, not from the cold, but from the betrayal of her own blood. He saw the sharp, panicked intelligence in her eyes. "Get the preacher," Gabriel said coldly. Within the hour, standing on the muddy steps of the courthouse with 4 guns trained on his back, Gabriel Cross married Abigail Stanton. She wore a stained, salt-ringed dress. He wore a wolf pelt coat. When Reverend Reed pronounced them man and wife, Ryan smirked, and Mayor Higgins slipped a silver dollar into the preacher's pocket. "Take your bride, Cross," Higgins sneered. "We'll be up to check on her well-being real soon." Gabriel hoisted Abigail back onto his horse. "If any of you step foot past the tree line," he said, loud enough for the entire square to hear, "I won't be aiming for your hats." The ride back up Bitterroot Ridge was suffocatingly tense. Abigail clung to the back of Gabriel's thick coat, the rough wool scratching her cheek. She was legally bound to a stranger, banished from the only home she had ever known, and thrust into the wilderness. By all rights, she should have been weeping. But as the air grew thinner and the pines grew denser, a strange, terrifying sensation began to bloom in Abigail's chest. It was freedom. For the first time in 32 years, no one was telling her to lower her voice. No one was chastising her for her limp. Her brother was gone. The sneering faces of the town gossips were miles below. When they reached the cabin, Gabriel dismounted and helped her down. He didn't look at her. "I ain't a husband," he said gruffly, uncinching the saddle. "And I know you didn't ask for this. You take the bed. I'll take the floor. Come spring, when the passes clear out to Cheyenne, I'll give you enough gold dust to start over somewhere else. You won't ever have to see me again." Abigail stood in the snow, looking at the massive, scarred man. "They planned to kill you, Gabriel," she said quietly. He paused, a heavy saddle in his hands. He looked over his shoulder. "I know. They think I am weak," she continued, stepping into the cabin and unpinning her sodden shawl. "They think I will convince you to sign away the timber rights, and if you refuse, they will murder you and force me to sign them over as your widow. My brother Ryan has my signature on a dozen blank ledgers down in Oakhaven. They will forge a deed of sale." Gabriel dropped the saddle. He walked into the cabin, pulling a rusted iron lockbox from beneath the floorboards. He slammed it onto the oak table and popped the latch with a hunting knife. Inside were stacks of thick, yellowed parchment. "They can try to steal it," Gabriel said, his jaw tight. "But my grandfather marched with General Fremont. The federal government deeded this whole ridge to my family in '56. I got the patents. Only problem is..." He looked away, a flicker of deep shame crossing his hardened face. "I can't read the damn things. The mayor's lawyers send me letters talking about eminent domain and squatters' limits. I just burn 'em. I know how to shoot, Abigail. I don't know the law." Abigail walked over to the table. She ran her pale, slender fingers over the wax seals and the dense, legal script of the federal land patents. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was a spinster who had spent the last 15 years silently reading every law book, history, text, and newspaper her brother had carelessly left in his study. She read the documents. Her eyes widened. "Gabriel," she whispered, looking up at him, "this isn't just the timber. What is it? Your grandfather didn't just secure the surface rights to Bitterroot Ridge. He secured the subterranean rights. And the water table..." She looked out the frosty window, down toward the distant, twinkling lights of Oakhaven. "The town's entire water supply comes from the Blackwood River, which originates on your land. The railroad spur they want to build, it has to cross your valley. You don't just own the mountain, Gabriel. You own Oakhaven's throat." Gabriel stared at her, realizing for the first time that the fragile, limping woman he had pulled from the snow possessed a mind sharper than a skinning knife. "They forced me into this marriage because they thought I was a pawn." Abigail's voice dropped, shedding the meek, subservient tone she had worn like a disguise her entire life. A cold, fierce fire ignited in her eyes. "They thought I was nothing but an old maid." She picked up the federal land patent, rolling it carefully. "Gabriel, you said you know how to shoot." "I do," he replied cautiously. "Teach me," Abigail said, turning to point at the heavy Winchester rifle resting over the mantel. "Teach me how to shoot. Teach me how to load it, how to clean it, and how to kill a man at 200 yards. And in return, I will teach you how to legally destroy a town." Over the next month, the mountain cabin transformed into a war room. By day, the deafening cracks of rifle fire echoed off the granite peaks. Gabriel was stunned by Abigail's aptitude. She was patient, devoid of ego, and possessed an unsettlingly steady hand. Her limp didn't matter when she was lying prone in the dirt, staring down the iron sights. She learned to hit a tin can at 50 paces, then a moving jackrabbit at 100. By night, by the light of a kerosene lantern, Abigail mapped out their legal strategy. She drafted cease and desist letters, writs of trespass, and injunctions. She realized that by forcing the marriage, Mayor Higgins had inadvertently legitimized Gabriel's estate in the eyes of the territorial governor in Denver, binding the mountain man's wild claim to Oak Haven's own civil registry. They were no longer two outcasts. They were a unified, fortified front, and they were falling in love. It wasn't a romance of poetry and flowers. It was a romance built on mutual respect, the smell of gun oil, and shared defiance. Gabriel found himself fascinated by the way her brow furrowed when she read, and the fierce, unrestrained laugh she let out when she finally hit a target at 200 yards. Abigail found herself drawn to his quiet strength, the gentle way his massive, calloused hands handled delicate things, and the unwavering respect he showed her, a respect no man had ever afforded her. But down in the valley, Oak Haven was growing impatient. It was the second week of June when Ryan Stanton and Deputy Elias Cobb led a posse of 6 men up the winding trail to Bitterroot Ridge. They brought a forged deed of sale and a coil of hangman's rope. Mayor Higgins had decided that waiting was a fool's game. It was time to make Abigail a widow. They rode into the clearing of the cabin, shouting for Gabriel to come out. The door creaked open, but it wasn't the giant mountain man who stepped onto the porch. It was Abigail. She wore a tailored canvas riding skirt and one of Gabriel's leather vests. Her hair, usually tied in a severe, tight bun, was braided down her back. But it was what she held in her hands that made Deputy Cobb pull hard on his horse's reins. Abigail held the Winchester repeating rifle, not like a terrified woman, but casually tucked against her shoulder, her finger resting lightly near the trigger guard. "Sister," Ryan said, trying to mask his shock with a nervous sneer, "we've come to rescue you from this brute, and we brought some papers for you to sign to make things right." Abigail cocked the lever of the Winchester. The metallic clack-clack echoed through the quiet clearing like a thunderclap. "Ryan," Abigail said, her voice carrying a terrifying, icy authority that made the posse's blood run cold, "you are trespassing on cross-family land. You have 10 seconds to turn those horses around, or I am going to put a bullet through Deputy Cobb's kneecap, and my husband, who currently has the sights of a Sharp's rifle aimed at the back of your skull from the tree line, is going to kill the rest of you." Ryan opened his mouth to laugh, but the sound died in his throat. A single, heavy bullet impacted the dirt precisely 3 inches from Ryan's horse's hooves, fired from the dense woods behind them. The horse reared, screaming. The old maid didn't flinch. She just smiled. 9 seconds, Abigail said. The 9 seconds elapsed in suffocating silence. Ryan Stanton's horse continued to dance in panicked, jerky circles, the whites of its eyes flashing wildly. Deputy Elias Cobb looked from the shattered earth near the hooves, up to the impassive, cold face of the woman he had dismissed as a crippled spinster just weeks prior. "Ryan," Cobb hissed, his voice barely a whisper, "pull back. He's got us dialed in." With a trembling hand, Ryan yanked his reins. The posse did not turn with dignity. They scrambled, horses kicking up clods of damp earth as they fled down the narrow mountain trail, practically tripping over one another to escape the invisible crosshairs of Gabriel Cross's Sharp's rifle. Abigail did not lower the Winchester until the sound of their hooves faded into the rustling of the blue spruce. Only then did she let out a long, shaky breath, her knees buckling slightly. A massive, warm hand caught her elbow before she could hit the porch boards. Gabriel stepped out from the shadows of the tree line, his heavy rifle slung effortlessly over his shoulder. He smelled of pine resin, gun oil, and cold wind. He looked down at her, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and profound reverence. "You didn't even blink," Gabriel murmured, his voice a low rumble in his chest. "I was terrified," Abigail confessed, though her grip on the rifle remained ironclad. "But my fear is my own business. Their fear is our weapon." That evening, the dynamic within the cabin shifted permanently. They were no longer a rescuer and a refugee, nor a reluctant husband and a forced bride. They were generals in a war room. The next morning, Abigail and Gabriel rode out, not down to Oakhaven, but north, taking the treacherous high-altitude pass toward the federal courthouse in Denver. It was a grueling 3-day ride, but Abigail sat tall in the saddle. Using Gabriel's accumulated gold dust from years of trapping, she hired the most ruthless land rights attorney in the territory, a man named Harrison Cole. When Cole reviewed the patents and Abigail's meticulously drafted injunctions, he laughed so hard he spilled his whiskey. "Mrs. Cross," Cole had said, wiping a tear from his eye, "you have legally neutered an entire municipality. The Pacific Railway cannot lay a single iron tie within 50 miles of Oakhaven without crossing your watershed, and you hold the federal deed to the water." By the time Abigail and Gabriel returned to Bitterroot Ridge, the legal paperwork was already making its way via armored stagecoach to the territorial governor. But Abigail knew that paper meant little to desperate, corrupt men like Mayor Josiah Higgins. They needed a physical demonstration of their absolute sovereignty. Summer was hitting Oakhaven hard. The timber mills relied entirely on the surging flow of the Blackwood River to power their massive saws, and the town's shallow wells were entirely fed by the mountain's runoff. Under Abigail's direction, Gabriel spent 2 weeks moving earth and stone. With the backbreaking labor of a man accustomed to hauling elk carcasses and the precise geometric calculations drawn in the dirt by Abigail, they constructed a temporary, rudimentary dam across the primary bottleneck of the Blackwood's headwaters. They didn't stop the flow entirely that would violate downstream federal mandates, but they choked it down to a meager, muddy trickle. Down in the valley, the effects were catastrophic and immediate. The great water wheels of Oakhaven's timber mills ground to a screeching, groaning halt. The riverbed, usually a roaring artery of silver water, was reduced to a stagnant creek. The town wells began to draw mud. Panic swept through the boardwalks like a cholera outbreak. Mayor Higgins stood on the dry banks of the Blackwood, his face purple with rage, holding a legally binding cease-and-desist letter delivered by a grinning Pony Express rider. The letter, drafted by Abigail, stated that the Cross estate was conducting essential hydrological maintenance on their private property, as was their federal right. "She's starving us out," Ryan Stanton yelled over the panicked murmurs of the townspeople. "That witch is trying to kill us." "She ain't trying to kill us, you fool," Higgins spat, crushing the letter in his fist. "She's holding us for ransom. The railway executives are due in 2 weeks to finalize the spur. If they see a dead river and a dead mill, they'll pull out, and we'll all be bankrupt." Up on the mountain, the atmosphere was entirely different. The dam had created a beautiful, deep reservoir of crystal-clear water behind the cabin. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the peaks, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and bruised purple, Abigail sat on the porch, a heavy quilt draped over her shoulders. Gabriel walked up the steps, handing her a tin cup of hot chicory coffee. He didn't take his usual spot by the door. Instead, he sat heavily on the wooden bench beside her, close enough that the heat radiating from his large frame fought off the mountain chill. "The mill stopped today," Gabriel noted quietly, looking down at the dark, silent valley. "Didn't hear the saws." "They will send someone soon," Abigail replied, blowing on the hot liquid. "Not a posse this time. Assassins. Higgins is out of legal options." Gabriel turned his head, studying her profile. The harsh lines of her face, etched by years of silent suffering in her brother's house, had softened. The mountain air had brought a fierce, healthy flush to her cheeks. "Why didn't you just leave?" Gabriel asked, a rare vulnerability cracking his gruff exterior. "When we went to Denver, you had the gold. You could have boarded a train east, started over, left the town and the mountain to rot." Abigail lowered her cup. She turned to face him, her gray eyes reflecting the dying light of the sun, because for the first time in my life, I have a home that is mine. And she paused, her gaze dropping for a fraction of a second to his lips before meeting his eyes again. I have a husband who listens when I speak. Gabriel's breath hitched. He had lived a life of brutal survival, a solitary existence where touch was only ever violent or utilitarian. Slowly, as if approaching a wild, easily spooked creature, he raised a calloused hand and brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. Abigail, he rumbled, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt since before the war. She leaned into his touch. We are married in the eyes of the law, Gabriel, she whispered fiercely. But I want us to be married in the eyes of this mountain. That night, the floorboards remained empty. Gabriel carried his wife to the heavy oak bed he had built with his own hands. There was no coercion, no fear, only a profound, consuming fire. Gabriel worshipped her with a desperate, gentle reverence, mapping the scars of her illness with his lips, making her feel not just whole, but powerful. In the darkness of the cabin, the mountain man and the spinster forged a bond written in blood, breath, and absolute trust. They were no longer just defending a land claim. They were defending their world. By the first week of August, Oakhaven was a powder keg. The mills remained silent. The railway executives had delayed their visit, citing unresolved territorial disputes. Mayor Josiah Higgins was hemorrhaging money, and his silent partners were threatening to have him removed permanently. Desperation breeds monsters, and Higgins found his in a man named Jebediah Boone. Boone was a former Confederate bushwhacker turned bounty hunter, a man who wore a necklace of silver Mexican pesos and left a trail of burned homesteads across the Dakota Territory. Higgins paid Boone $3,000, emptying the town's treasury to ascend Bitterroot Ridge, retrieve the federal patents, and ensure that Gabriel and Abigail Cross suffered fatal, unrecognizable accidents. Ryan Stanton, sweating and terrified of the monster Higgins had brought into their town, volunteered to act as Boone's guide. I know the layout of the cabin, Ryan stammered to the scarred mercenary. I know my sister's routines. I don't care about her routines, Boone rasped, sharpening a Bowie knife on a whetstone. I care about drawing the big man out. On a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, the smell of wood smoke drifted into the cabin. Gabriel, who was chopping firewood in the yard, paused, his nose flaring. He looked toward the western slope, where the dense, dry timber of the ancient pines was highly combustible. A thick plume of dirty black smoke was rising into the sky. Brush fire, Gabriel said, his face paling. If the western slope caught, the wind would carry the inferno straight to the cabin, wiping out everything they had built and destroying the very timber the town wanted. Abigail stepped onto the porch, a pair of brass binoculars pressed to her eyes. It's too localized, Gabriel. It's not a lightning strike. The sky is clear. She lowered the lenses, her expression hardening into a mask of cold realization. It's a diversion. Gabriel looked at the smoke, then back at Abigail. The tactical reality was grim. If he didn't cut a fire break right now, they would burn to death. If he left, he was leaving Abigail undefended against whatever was lurking in the woods. I have to stop the line of the fire, Gabriel said, his voice agonizingly torn. He grabbed his heavy felling axe and his sharps rifle. Go, Abigail ordered, turning back into the cabin. She didn't panic. She didn't cry. I will hold the property. Gabriel grabbed her face, kissing her hard and desperately. If you hear them, you shoot through the door. You don't wait to see the whites of their eyes. With that, the mountain man sprinted into the dense woods, heading west toward the smoke. Abigail bolted the heavy oak door. She pulled the iron shutters closed over the windows, plunging the cabin into a stifling, amber gloom. She walked to the center of the room, picked up the Winchester, and checked the chamber. Then she retrieved Gabriel's spare Colt revolver and tucked it into her waistband. She dragged the heavy iron lockbox containing the patents to the hearth, took a seat in the darkest corner of the room behind an overturned table, and waited. She didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes after Gabriel disappeared, the crunch of boots on dry pine needles echoed outside. Mrs. Cross, a gravelly, unfamiliar voice called out. Jebediah Boone, we smell the smoke. We come up from the valley to help you evacuate. Open the door. Abigail remained utterly silent. She raised the Winchester, resting the heavy barrel on the edge of the overturned table, aiming directly at the center of the wooden door. "Sister, please," Ryan's voice rang out, trembling with genuine terror. "The whole ridge is going to burn. Gabriel is likely dead already. Just open the door and give them the papers." Abigail's finger tightened on the trigger. The mention of her brother's voice, pleading with her to surrender, triggered a cold, mechanical fury inside her. For 32 years, Ryan had kept her locked in a cage of domestic servitude. He had traded her to a supposed savage to save his own neck. Now, he was aiding in her murder. "Kick it in," Boone's voice growled. A massive crash shook the cabin frame. The heavy oak door splintered but held. Another crash. The hinges screamed. On the third kick, the door flew open, slamming against the interior wall. The blinding afternoon sunlight flooded the room, outlining the silhouettes of 3 men. Abigail didn't hesitate. She didn't offer a warning. She fired. The Winchester roared in the confined space. The lead mercenary stepping through the threshold took the bullet directly in the center of his chest, thrown backward off the porch into the dirt. "She's armed! Fire through the walls!" Boone bellowed, diving out of the doorway. The cabin erupted in a hail of lead. Bullets tore through the timber, shattering pottery and throwing wooden splinters into the air. Abigail kept her head down behind the thick oak table, the noise deafening. She waited for the volley to pause as they reloaded. When the shooting stopped for a fraction of a second, Abigail popped up from her barricade. She saw Boone trying to flank the window. She fired twice. The first shot missed. The second shattered Boone's forearm, sending his pistol flying into the brush. He screamed, clutching his bleeding arm, and scrambled for cover behind the water trough. "Ryan!" Boone roared. "Shoot her, you coward!" Ryan stood frozen near the edge of the clearing, holding a trembling 6-shooter, staring in horror at the carnage. He looked at the doorway, trying to peer into the smoke-filled gloom of the cabin. "Abby," Ryan whimpered. Suddenly, a sound like a thunderclap echoed from the tree line. A massive pine tree at the edge of the clearing seemingly exploded. Gabriel Cross burst from the brush, his face covered in soot and ash, his eyes blazing with a feral, demonic rage. He had chopped the firebreak, heard the gunshots, and run a mile straight uphill. He didn't even raise his rifle. He dropped it, drawing his heavy hunting knife with one hand and his Colt with the other. The remaining mercenary turned, raising his shotgun, but Gabriel was moving too fast. The mountain man tackled the hired gun, driving him into the dirt with bone-crushing force. Boone, realizing the tide had turned, scrambled to his feet, clutching his ruined arm, and ran for the horses. A single shot rang out from the cabin door. Boone's leg buckled, a Winchester round tearing through his calf. He collapsed into the dust, howling in agony. Abigail stepped out onto the porch. Her hair had come loose from its braid, falling wildly over her shoulders. Her face was streaked with gunpowder residue. The Winchester was pressed firmly to her shoulder, the barrel smoking. Gabriel stood up slowly from the unconscious mercenary, breathing heavily. He looked at the bodies in the yard, then looked up at his wife standing on the porch, an avenging angel cast in iron and gunsmoke. Only one man was left standing. Ryan Stanton dropped his gun. He fell to his knees in the dirt, weeping uncontrollably, holding his hands up in surrender as Gabriel slowly walked toward him, the bloody hunting knife still in his hand. "Gabriel, please," Ryan sobbed, staring up at the terrifying giant. "I'm her brother! I'm her flesh and blood!" Gabriel stopped a few feet away. He didn't look at Ryan. He looked up at Abigail. "Your call, Mrs. Cross," Gabriel said quietly. Abigail walked slowly down the wooden steps, her limp barely noticeable. She walked through the lingering gun smoke, stepping over the groaning Boone, until she stood directly in front of her brother. Ryan looked up at her, expecting to see the meek, frightened girl he had bullied her whole life. Instead, he saw the undisputed queen of Bitterroot Ridge. Abigail stood over her trembling brother, the acrid scent of burnt gunpowder hanging heavy in the afternoon heat. Ryan Stanton, a man who had spent his entire adult life dictating the narrow, suffocating terms of Abigail's existence, was now reduced to a whimpering mess in the dirt of Bitterroot Ridge. Gabriel remained a few paces back, his chest heaving, his dark eyes locked on his wife. He held the bloody hunting knife loosely at his side, a silent executioner awaiting the Queen's decree. "Abby, please," Ryan choked out, his hands clasped together in desperate prayer. "I didn't know he was going to burn the ridge. I just wanted the papers. Higgins forced me to come. You have to believe me." Abigail looked down at the man who shared her blood. She felt no pity, but she also felt no desire to see him bleed. Death was too quick a punishment for a man whose greatest sin was a lifetime of quiet, arrogant cruelty. "I am not going to kill you, Ryan," Abigail said, her voice eerily calm, cutting through the ringing silence of the clearing, "because a bullet is a merciful thing, and you do not deserve mercy. You deserve exactly what you gave me for 32 years. Ryan blinked, his face smeared with sweat and ash. What do you mean?" "I mean you are going to be nothing," Abigail stated, her gray eyes hard as mountain granite. "You are going to walk back down this mountain. You will go to your grand house, and you will pack a single valise. You will sign the deeds of your home and your mercantile over to the Cross estate as reparations for this attack. And then you will walk to the train station and leave Colorado Territory forever." "Abigail, you can't. That's everything I own," Ryan wailed, horrified. "I'll be destitute." Abigail cocked the Winchester rifle, the metallic snap echoing like a judge's gavel. She pointed the barrel directly at his chest. "You can leave with your life in a single bag, Ryan. Or you can stay here and fertilize my husband's garden. Choose." Ryan looked at the cold, lifeless eyes of the mercenary in the yard, then at the terrifying bulk of Gabriel Cross. Shaking violently, he hauled himself to his feet, nodded once, and began the long, humiliating walk down the mountain trail, leaving his horse behind. Once Ryan was out of sight, Abigail lowered the rifle. The adrenaline suddenly drained from her limbs, and she swayed. Gabriel was there in an instant, dropping his weapons to catch her in his massive arms. He held her tightly against his soot-stained chest, burying his face in her hair. "It's over," Gabriel rumbled, his voice thick with relief. "No," Abigail murmured, resting her head against his racing heart. "It's just beginning." They did not waste time. They bound the wounded Jebediah Boone and hoisted him over a pack-horse. While Gabriel ensured the firebreak held against the smoldering brush, Abigail gathered the federal patents. The next morning, they bypassed Oakhaven entirely and rode hard for Denver, delivering the notorious bushwhacker directly to Federal Marshal Thomas Sterling. Facing the hangman's noose, Boone sang like a canary. He detailed Mayor Josiah Higgins's embezzlement, the forged deeds, and the hired hit. 3 days later, a detachment of federal cavalry rode into Oakhaven. They arrested Mayor Higgins and Deputy Cobb on the steps of the courthouse, shackling them in irons and dragging them to the territorial prison. With the town's corrupt leadership gutted, Oakhaven was thrown into absolute chaos. The river was still choked by Gabriel's Dam, the timber mills were bankrupt, and the Pacific Railway executives had finally arrived on a private train car, demanding answers. They found their answers not in the mayor's office, but at the summit of Bitterroot Ridge. Cornelius Pratt, the lead executive for the Pacific Railway, rode up the mountain with 2 lawyers, expecting to negotiate with an illiterate, savage mountain man. Instead, he was seated at a heavy oak table, served chicory coffee, and forced to negotiate with Abigail Cross. Abigail had laid out the federal land patents, the subterranean water rights, and a meticulously drafted lease agreement. "You want to build a spur through our valley, Mr. Pratt," Abigail said, adjusting the cuffs of her neat cotton dress. "You may do so, but you will not buy the land. You will lease the right-of-way from the Cross estate for $5,000 annually. Furthermore, my husband will hold the exclusive contract to supply the timber for your railroad ties, harvested sustainably at a premium rate." Pratt, a ruthless businessman from Chicago, laughed in disbelief. "And if we refuse, Mrs. Cross, then you can route your train through the granite passes of the next county over, which will cost your investors roughly $3 million in dynamite alone," Abigail replied smoothly. "And Oakhaven will die of thirst." Pratt stared at the quiet, limping woman, recognizing a predator far more dangerous than any grizzly bear. He signed the contract that afternoon. Within a year, the transformation was absolute. The Cross estate opened the dam, allowing the Blackwood River to flow again, but only after the town council agreed to pay a municipal utility tax directly to Abigail and Gabriel. Ryan Stanton's seized home was converted by Abigail into a fully funded schoolhouse and library for the town's children, ensuring no mind would ever be starved for knowledge as hers had been. Gabriel never had to hunt for survival again. He hired a dozen men to run his logging operations, paying them double the standard wage, earning their fierce, undying loyalty. The Savage of Bitterroot Ridge became the territory's most respected employer. Yet, despite their immense wealth and power, Abigail and Gabriel never moved down into the valley. They remained in the expanded, fortified cabin on the mountain. To the townspeople below, they were royalty feared, respected, and entirely untouchable. Historical ledgers from the 1880s in the Colorado State Archives still bear the neat, elegant signature of Abigail Cross alongside the heavy, deliberate X of her husband on the charter for the Blackwood Valley Logging Company. They built an empire out of wood, water, and vengeance, proving that the most fatal mistake a society can make is to hand a brilliant, marginalized woman the matches to burn it all down. The legend of Abigail and Gabriel Cross remains a testament to the fatal mistake of underestimating the quiet ones. Oakhaven tried to bury a spinster and a mountain man, but instead, they planted the seeds of their own conquerors. Bound by survival and forged in fire, their marriage proved that true power isn't given by society, it is taken by those brave enough to claim it.
Hi, my name is Ivy Duck Devotion, the owner and manager of Ivy Duck Devotion. After watching the video, they forced the mountain man to marry the old maid. What she did next terrified the county. I really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was how quickly people underestimated her before truly knowing who she was. The phrase old maid carried so much judgment from the beginning, and I think that's what made the story's emotional shift so satisfying. Sometimes the people others dismiss or mock are carrying strength, intelligence, or pain far deeper than anyone realizes, until something finally pushes them too far. Do you think the county feared her because of what she did, or because she shattered the image they had unfairly placed on her for years? And why do you think society is often uncomfortable with people who refuse to stay trapped in the role others assign them? Stories like this remind us how dangerous assumptions can be, and how important it is to see people beyond labels and gossip. If this story kept you thinking after it ended, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy emotional mountain man stories filled with tension, resilience, and unexpected twists, feel free to like and subscribe only if you'd like to see more.